So thank you very much. Before we start with the first substantive presentation by Alain Berthaud, we thought it was useful to talk a little bit about the context that we'll be dealing with in the next few days, and to address some definitions of things that I'm sure that many of us will talk about when we talk about transport infrastructure investments in global city clusters. Now, of course, transport authorities are clearly preoccupied with the movement of vehicles in our cities, and perhaps more preoccupied when those vehicles stop due to congestion. And that's because transport authorities are on the front lines when cities face these problems. So while transport authorities are quite concentrated on vehicles, we have to remember that the success of our cities and of our city clusters rests on how well our cities allow people to access each other, to access services, to access jobs, to access goods. At the heart of our cities are people. And at the heart of the success of our transport policies are how well we serve people. But this is challenging, especially in areas, in regions where our cities and our city clusters are developing quite rapidly. Like here in the Beijing, Tianjin, I'm sorry for Hebei because I know it's part of the cluster, but I didn't show it on the map. When we look at the expansion of built-up area between 2000 and 2010. In response, transport authorities have deployed multiple forms of transport infrastructure. They range from subways inside our cities, the classic rail network, the high-speed rail network, and motorways, in an attempt to make access become easier within cities and in between cities. These investments are expensive, but in counterpart, we have the full expectation that they deliver benefits. But what can we say about those benefits? I'll talk about three definitions, three ways of describing those benefits that emerge from multiple roundtables that the International Transport Forum has held in the past, and that may serve as a reference when we discuss our work here today. The first is that we expect these projects to deliver direct benefits. These are the benefits, revenues, and costs to users, to people, to operators, infrastructure providers and managers, and to governments. Direct transport impacts, of course, are clearly the first line of appraisal when we look at where and when to make transport investments. These, as I said, look at user impacts that relate to travel time, savings or losses, reliability, the planability, the predictability of trips. This is a very important factor. Relief from overcrowding. Of course, anyone who's traveled in a major city like Beijing at rush hour on the subway or on the roads knows that these systems are overcrowded. We also look at revenue effects in these direct benefits, these direct impacts. Revenue effects for operators and managers. We also looked at the direct environmental impacts on pollutants, noise, and also greenhouse gas emissions. And we also look at the direct safety impacts that are related to mortality and morbidity, early death and serious injuries. The second definition looks at how these transport investments affect the longer-term changes in land use. Because when we look at direct transport impacts, we assume land use doesn't change. So here we're looking at the mid to long-term changes in land use patterns that are induced by our transport investments. Now, these are sometimes difficult to measure, because it's hard to disassociate, to identify precisely what is due to the transport investment, what is new, or what is simply moved from another part of the region. And data is often lacking here. But when there are these long-term changes in job markets and land uses, we can think about the wider economic benefits of transport investments. These are the mid to long-term effects in labor, goods, and service markets that are additional to the direct transport impacts that we talked about earlier. And many of these stem from induced land use changes. Now, when discussing the wider economic benefits of this type of investment, we should not assume that increased transport investments lead to improved economic vitality in all cases. It isn't the case when we look at the evidence and countries look at the evidence. The context in which these transport investments occur and the stage of growth of the region in which the transport investments occur matter. In a well-connected region, in a mature transport market, additional transport investments do not always deliver the benefits we expect because the declining margins of return are an issue. There are issues relating to macroeconomic appraisal that are involved when we look at the wider economic benefits. From a theoretical point of view, conceptually, the direct economic benefits, induced land use change, and wider economic benefits, the three things I talked about earlier, can be captured by linking microeconomic and macroeconomic appraisal. But in practice, this is rarely done at sufficiently a rigorous enough level because data is often lacking and monitoring is insufficient. And a final word before we go to our first keynote on the dynamic and structuring effects of these transport investments and our appraisal. We know from our work with previous roundtables, we know from our contact with national governments and with regional governments that assessing how large changes in transport system impacts the regional economy and land use occur. That is a challenge that many regions face, and it is difficult to understand and describe in an adequate manner how projects or how major investments will change land use over time and change markets, labor markets, service markets. But that's not the only challenge. The other challenge is trying to forecast what would have happened if no investment was made. And when we look at long-term investments that have a life of 50 or more years, that is an equally important challenge, but one that is often overlooked. So with that, three definitions and some issues relating to appraisal that it's worthwhile keeping in mind. This is accumulated wisdom, if you will, that comes from previous roundtables before we now talk about some of the specific examples and some of the next keynote, which will talk specifically about cities as labor markets. 谢谢。